Today's message is brought to you by the two problems of foolish obstinacy and anti-Semitism. And if you don't know what those words mean, that's okay. I will explain them as we go through this sermon. But quick review of what the story of Esther is all about, right? Esther is a story about how a nobody young Jewish woman becomes queen of the mighty Persian Empire miraculously, and then from that position saves the Jewish people from a genocide. And so far, what we've gone through is in chapter 1, obviously the original Persian queen, in order for Esther to become queen, the original Persian queen Vashti has to lose her spot. And then last week we looked in chapter 2 how, and I've got it under quotations because nobody wins in a harem, as we looked at last week. But Esther wins the harem sweepstakes and is made queen. Today we're going to look at chapter 3. Now you're wondering how on earth in the last two sermons we're going to get through all 10 chapters of Esther. And the reason we're going to do that very easily is literally the last 7 chapters are incredibly repetitive. All right? So the storyline of how this genocide develops is a very repetitive back and forth story the last bunch of chapters. But anyway, today we're going to look at chapter 3, which is the story of how an enemy arises. All right? An enemy arises. And so we jump into chapter 3, verse 1. We get introduced to a new character. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman. All right? Everybody say Haman. No, not Haman. Haman. Yes, some of you had it. I heard a little bit of like a hiss, like a Haman, okay? Evil Haman. This is a bad guy, in case you were wondering. All right? Son of Hammedatha, the Agagite or Agagite. We'll get to that later, but just trying to say that is hard. But anyway, Haman, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. So here's a new character in the story, and he is, as we're going to find out, extremely, extremely evil. However, King Xerxes, as in everything in this story, is oblivious, all right? And so he not only honors Haman, he, elevates him. And all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. All right? So, and this was common in the ancient world. But the king says, this is the next top official after me. Second most important person in the empire of Persia is going to be Haman. And I want everybody to kneel or bow to him when he is around or comes in or whatever, all right? So, and then now we're going to get a problem. All right? So we already know Haman's going to be bad. I've given that part away. And the king has raised him up to this top position. And now we're going to run into our first problem because Mordecai, remember we got introduced to Mordecai, who is a huge central figure, as big a figure in this story as Esther herself. But Mordecai, by the way, this is all part of verse 2, but Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. And of course, we might think to ourselves here, like, come on, Mordecai. I mean, in chapters 1 and 2, we actually saw, well, chapter 2 actually. In chapter 2, we saw that we talked a lot about how Mordecai and Esther have been flying under the radar. Remember that? They've been hiding their Jewishness. They've been intentionally not following lots of the Jewish laws of Moses from the Old Testament. They've been flying under the radar. They've not been drawing attention to themselves. They've not been causing trouble. And now Mordecai, over something that is, doesn't seem like a huge deal, is suddenly making a big deal about himself. Suddenly, he's causing problems. Why on earth would Mordecai not bow? Like, why would you draw attention to yourself in this way? Why would you cause trouble? And over the years, as we Christians are wont to do, many different speculative ideas have been, put out there by preachers and teachers and writers and commentators of why Mordecai refused to bow to Haman. Now, one of the most popular ideas, one of the most common ideas over the centuries that many Christians have said, why did Mordecai not bow to Haman, is this one. It's the idea that perhaps Mordecai thought bowing to Haman was an act of idolatry. And that's kind of an easy thing for us as Christians to just think. Like, we're always looking for, I just want a quick, simple answer for why this thing is in the text. So, well, that sounds like a good idea, because obviously bowing to an idol is a bad thing. So maybe bowing to Haman was like an idolatrous thing. And the only problem with that idea is it's not true. All right? People in ancient times, but I mean, even nowadays, if you are granted, I mean, Queen Elizabeth just passed away, right, last year or whenever that was, or if you were in her presence, or King Charles, there's certain protocols, like you bow or you curtsy or these various things. Human beings throughout history have thought, bowing and giving respect to leaders is a perfectly acceptable thing that has nothing to do with idolatry. And in fact, I could show you many examples in the Old Testament, many examples, far more than we could ever look at, of important biblical characters bowing to other people. I'll just show you two quick ones. Here's Abraham. Then Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land, the Hittites. Was Abraham worshiping the Hittites? No. This is after they sold him a cave so he could bury his wife Sarah in it. It's just a show of respect. He bows to them, right? Here's another great one. We should all try this at our Christmas gatherings to our father-in-laws this year, okay? So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. Okay? So there's my father-in-law over there. Dad will try that this year, okay? So they greeted each other and then went into the tent, okay? So, okay. It's not worship. This bowing down, kneeling, this is a common thing in human history. It was an innocent thing in ancient times, all right? So Mordecai's reason for not kneeling or bowing here has nothing to do with idolatry. So if we go back to Esther then, what is his reason? And the author of Esther knows that this is a problem for us, because we have to figure out, like, why would he, I mean, it's kind of just out of pocket. Like, he's just, all of a sudden, randomly, we're doing this thing, right? By the way, that little phrase, out of pocket, that's me connecting with the young people here. If you don't understand what that means, don't worry about it. All right, so Esther 3. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" So here's our chance. The author knows that this is a problem. The author knows that Mordecai should have a good reason for not bowing to Haman. All right? And so he sets it up with a question. Here's a question. That way he can answer it. Now we can have a defense, because we know Mordecai's the good guy, so Mordecai has to have a good reason for not doing it. And day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. In other words, no answer. No good reason. Incidentally, quick little rabbit trail here. Have you ever noticed, as Christians, and actually all people do this, not just Christians, but we're mostly Christians here in this room, so I'll speak to us. Have you ever noticed how whenever we read a story or hear a story about our people, we always assume that they always have good reasons for what they do, and it's hard for us to criticize people on our own team. Have you ever noticed that? It's kind of a human thing. We human beings do this all the time with the Bible. We read the book of Esther, and we know Mordecai's one of the good guys. He's one of our team, so we don't want to criticize him. He must have a good reason for why he does what he does. But actually, if we step back, we have to understand that our team often messes up too. Haman has no good reason. He is just disobeying the king, and he's being disrespectful. This is foolish obstinacy. Foolish obstinacy. Now, I'm not saying this is Mordecai's whole character is defined by foolish obstinacy. None of us is that simple. None of us is always bad, and none of us is always good. But the fact is, in this instant, Mordecai is being ridiculous. And the problem is, it's actually going to raise problems, not just for him, it's going to raise problems for his entire people. He should keep. A wise person in this case would just kneel and continue, flying under the radar. But he is actually going to start a fire that does not need to be started. And I have to just, let us sit on that for just a moment, because this is one of the practical things that I think some of us need to think about and take away from this sermon. There's some other stuff we're going to look at that we're going to move on to, but I want us just to stop here for just a moment. See, there are people who make problems bigger, and there are people who make problems smaller. Have you ever noticed that? Some of us here, and there's a mix of us here, and by the way, all of us are a mix. Sometimes I make problems worse, and sometimes I make problems better, and that's probably true of all of us, and to various extents. But some of us we go in, when there's a fire, we don't calm the fire down, we make it bigger, we make it hotter, we make it spread quicker. Now let me ask you something. As followers of Jesus, what kind of people should we be? And Jesus was very clear about this in Matthew chapter 5. He said this, blessed are the what? Peacemakers. We're just with a little more conviction. Blessed are the peacemakers. Following Jesus, now you might not like that, and that's okay. You might not like that. You're like, I don't like that. My personality is I just like to say it how it is. I like to blow things up. I like to overreact. Well, then that's all great for you, and I'm sure it's great for your loved ones and the people around you. But it's just not what Jesus is. So that's not following Jesus. You might say, well, I just opt out of that one. Okay, fine. But this is what this. Blessed are the peacemakers. For what? They will be called the children of God. This is how a child of God acts. But how many of us in our problems, how many of us are in situations right now where we actually just need to take stock and say, like, is this really that big of a deal? Or is this just me being obstinate, like Mordecai, and making a fire out of something that does not need to be fired? Mordecai is foolishly obstinate for no apparent reason. All right, well, of course, Haman's going to escalate things. So Mordecai starts a fire that he shouldn't. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Okay, so Haman obviously is, he's going to be bad. Well, we're going to see that because this just gets completely out of control. This next verse, Mordecai is foolish and obstinate in this situation, but what happens next is just completely insane. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, and we don't have time to get into that, but at the end of chapter 2, Mordecai talks to some of the officials and actually tells that he's a Jew. Up to that point, he's been hiding it. Haman finds out that he's a Jew. He scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews. Okay, so yikes. Okay, this man is evil. Again, Mordecai is foolish. And his foolishness is going to put all of his people in real danger. But there's no excuse, obviously, for this. There's absolutely no excuse. This is what happens when you take two escalators and put them, and I'm talking about people who escalate things, not two escalators. As soon as I said that doesn't make any sense. This is what happens when you take two people who are escalators and you put them in a conflict. You have a nothing burger. You have nothing there. There's nothing worth fighting over. And all of a sudden, boom, we're at genocide. To destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. But now, here's where we have to go a little deeper here, because as modern Christians, we're missing something really important that all of the ancient Jews were already thinking when they got to this part of the story. See, at this part of the story, a lot of us as modern Christians, I just laughed about it, right? We just kind of laugh. It's like, wow, that's an overreaction. Like, whoa, now I'm killing a whole people group. But there's actually something very specifically going on here that is far more sinister and far deeper than just an overreaction, but we miss it. And it has to do with who Haman is. All right, so let's go back to verse 1. And something a code for ancient Jews that they would have picked up right on that we don't. And remember what it said in the beginning. Remember in ancient stories, when they introduce a character, whatever attributes they give to that character, those characteristics are going to be really important in the story. So remember when they introduced Esther, she was pretty and she had a lovely what? Figure. Yeah, there we go. And Mordecai, he's a Jew, he's in the king's court, all this sort of stuff, right? So, because that's going to be important to the story. Haman is introduced as and I want you guys all to try this as well, so I'll say it for you once, Agagite. Agagite. So why is this Haman's introduction? Now, we, modern Christians, we read this story, we hear this story, we think, no big deal, there's a whole bunch of ites all over the Old Testament. There's the Ammonites and the Jebusites and the Karasites and the Canaanites and all kinds of ites. This is just another one of the ites. No biggie. Except for one small thing. There was never a group of people known as the Agagites. Did you know that? There was not a place called Agag. There's no Agag, there's no Agagites in history. So you say, well, then, and so that just makes us even more curious. Why is this in the introduction? And why is he called an Agagite? Well, in order to find that out, which an ancient Jew would have picked up on this right away, and I'm going to show you how, but we have to first do a little bit of detective work in the Old Testament. So if you know your Old Testament at all, and we could go on a long rabbit trail here on some stuff, but I'm going to just skip through it very quickly. You would know that there was many people groups that the Israelites fought with in the early days after they came out of Egypt. There is one nation that pops up a number of different times that kind of rises above the others in terms of being Israel's sort of number one, public enemy number one. This is kind of the worst of the worst, and there's multiple passages where Moses or Samuel or various leaders of Israel say, we are never in any generation ever going to make peace with this people group. All right? And you say, well, what people group was this? Like, what people group was sort of like the worst of their enemies? Well, we're going to go to a famous story in 1 Samuel chapter 15. And this story is actually going to show us the link of what's going on here in Esther. So let's go. 1 Samuel 15, famous story. You're going to pick up on this pretty quick for those of you who know the Old Testament. So the prophet Samuel says to Saul, that's King Saul, Israel's first king, this is what the Lord Almighty says, I will punish the Amalekites. Okay, no, so that's not Agagites yet. We're going to get there. There's Amalekites, but the Amalekites, or Amalekites, however you want to say it, the Amalekites were public enemy number one. And I could show you a number of verses, we just don't have time. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. So the Amalekites were the first group of people to attack Israel and try to wipe them out. All right? But we keep going in this story. So the Amalekites are going to be really important in this story. All right? So now Samuel says to Saul, now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them, put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep. He goes on and on. And by the way, I just have to pause here for a moment. Because remember I said before, a few minutes ago in the sermon, I said, when we Christians think about people on our team, we always think they're good. So then we read passages like this, and then we try to explain it away. So we just need to think about something for a minute. This is disgusting. If it's bad in Esther for Haman to want to kill all the Jews, how can we be consistent and say it's okay for the Israelites to want to kill all the Amalekites? Does that make any sense? No. This is the Old Testament, and the Israelites did not yet have the revelation of God as Jesus. This is not the way of Jesus. And we don't have to pretend it is. It isn't. It's gross. All right? But anyway, Samuel has no idea that God is fully revealed in Jesus Christ, and so they're going to go on this genocide. Now, famous story. What's Saul going to do next? Now, some of you know, some of you don't. All right, so Saul's supposed to go out, according to Samuel, and kill everybody. But, well, there's that word, Agag, however you want to say it. Saul took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive. Oh. Remember what Haman was. Haman was an Agagite. Saul took Agag alive. This is a famous story. But Saul and the army spared Agag in the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. So this is the story. Saul comes back, and he loses his mind. He says, you're losing the kingdom. And then he kills Agag. Anyway, here we get Agag. Now you say, oh, I see. So Haman must have been a descendant of King Agag. Well, not quite. Actually, Agag died, and all of his descendants died. However, because of this story, because of this famous story, and because of the Amalekites, over the centuries, the Jewish people came to use this label. Like, you know how sometimes people in modern times, we will use the term Nazi. Like the Nazis in World War II have become this sort of like label for anything like super, super, super evil or genocidal. And we'll use that as a label. They're like the Nazis for us. And everybody in our day knows what that means. In ancient times, the Jews did the same thing what we do with the label Nazis. They did with Amalekites and the Amalekites' king Agag. They called anyone who hated their people, anyone who oppressed the Jews, they called them Agagite or Agagite or I don't know what, something like that, spelled that way. So for an ancient Jew, and we have lots of examples of this in ancient writings, right around the time of Esther, we have and after, in the time of Christ, we have Jewish writers who call the Romans Agagites, because they're a symbol. Agagite has come to mean anyone who specifically hates the Jewish people. And unfortunately, this is just a horrific fact of history, is that throughout history, over and over again, there's been this repetition of this horrible thing where different people want to wipe out the Jews. And when Jewish people in the centuries before Jesus are hearing the story of Esther, they're not just hearing, oh, this is a neat story about some woman, blah, 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 who come and God saved us. They're hearing something that horrifies, disturbs, and terrifies them. This is something they've gone through before. Why is it that some of these world leaders are anti-Semitic? They just hate Jews. And again, so some of you, maybe you're young people here, you don't know what anti-Semitic means. Here's what it means. When you hear this in the news, anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic or anti-Semite, anti-Semitism is a specific kind of racism. It's racism, hatred and racism specifically directed towards Jewish people in particular. And it's still a reality in our day today. Anti-Semitism is a very real thing. And it's this bizarre, evil, horrible thing that has happened throughout history. Now, Esther is a story. When the author of Esther introduces Haman as an Agagite, it would kind of be like for us introducing someone as a Hitlerite or something like that. In the moment the author of Esther does that, we realize that a big theme of this book, this is not just some random thing. This is a book that is speaking to ancient Jews about a very real historical problem. This is a book about, partially, one of its themes is anti-Semitism. Now you say, here we are here in Steinbach, we're a Crossview church, okay? Most of us have absolutely no racism towards the Jewish people. We would never think that way. We don't know anybody that is anti-Semitic. We know maybe that's a problem out there. You say, well, why should we talk about this in church other than the fact that it's actually in the Bible? So let me give you a few reasons why I think it's so important for us to talk about this in church. And the first reason is this. Here's the horrific truth. Historically, Christians as a group have been the worst. Not just one of. We have been the worst perpetrators of anti-Semitism. Did you know that? Lots of Christians go to church all their lives and never learn this fact. So we read the story of Esther. We read the story of Esther and we see Haman and we go, what an evil character. Haman is evil. Terrible guy. And never make the connection that as a group, Christians have been the worst Haman in history on a group level. It started right very early in the early church. Many church leaders and church fathers, including a number of the guys who were responsible for deciding which books were going to go into the Bible, were anti-Semitic. And they used in the first centuries after Christ, one of the most common labels that Christians had for Jews was Christ killers. Christians just called Jews, they're just the Christ killers. Just a label. There's a label, boom, catchy, and it sticks. The most effective hate labels are just like that. They're catchy and they stick. Never mind the fact that 99.9999999% of the Jews who were alive during the time of Christ or in all of history since had nothing to do with Christ's death, or the fact that killing Jesus was a team effort between Jews and non-Jews. It was Roman soldiers who did all the beating and torturing and nailing and killing. Or the fact that every non-Jewish people group has a heinous list of innocent murders on their hands. Christians said, nope, they are the Christ killers. And that went on for centuries in the early church, with most modern Christians, when we think of the early church, we think that they were a bunch of saints. They were far from saints. And then for 600 years, starting in the Spanish Inquisition in the 1300s, for 600 years, it was Christian nations in Europe that were far and away the worst persecutors of Jews, right up until the Holocaust. And Hitler and the Nazis were not Christians, which then Christians think, well, that had nothing to do with us. But Hitler was building off of racism that had been in Europe for hundreds of years and loved to quote Christian leaders like Martin Luther. Pogroms. Did you know that between the 1300s and the 1900s, there were hundreds and hundreds of examples in Christian nations, in Christian towns and cities all over Europe of Christian mobs burning and attacking Jewish people? And we wonder why. Many Christians today don't realize, did you know that the vast majority of Jewish people today are hugely suspicious around the world, are hugely suspicious of Christians? And I hear some Christians glibly say, well, they're just hardened towards Jesus. They're hardened because of us. They're hardened because of history. There's a history there. We've been some of the worst. So how does this theme in Esther speak to us today? I want to show you three things. I think this one is so important. Humility is not just an individual sport. Humility is not just tennis, singles tennis, or singles table tennis, ping pong, which I love. Humility is also meant to be a group thing. Did you know that? Lots of us as Christians, we talk about humility at church, lots. Most churches talk about humility lots and lots and lots and lots. And that's because the Bible talks about humility lots and lots and lots. But we in the West have a very individualistic view of the Bible, that the only thing the Bible talks to is how do I live in my personal life? But most of what the Bible has to say actually has to do with us as a group. So we talk about individual humility in our individual personal lives, but very few Christians in modern times ever think about Christianity and what we're like as a group in society. And most people do not feel like humility is a great trait we exhibit as a group. And part of the problem is because as Christians, we have a very checkered past in history, and most of us don't know our own history. We grow up only ever hearing the good things that Christians have done. And by the way, Christians have done many great things, which is amazing. And many Christians today continue to do wonderful, amazing, great, good things in the world. That's awesome. The problem is that as Christians, we have also done lots of really bad, ugly stuff. And because we don't know that, many Christians go to church all their life and they have no idea that the history of Christianity is anything but all this amazing stuff. And we aren't taught about horrific anti-Semitism for literally 2,000 years. We're not taught that slavery in the United States lasted far longer than it would have because of massive amounts of Christian support, Christians using the Bible, Christians of influence and pastors teaching that slavery based on the Bible is a good thing. We're not taught about these things. How often Christians have been at the forefront of oppressing women and all these things. You're like, oh, I don't like to hear this in church. I agree. But we actually need to have much more humility as a church, or as a group of Christians. And here's why. Because we're only told all the good things Christians do, we start to think that we are God's gift to the world. But I want to explain something to you. We Christians are not God's gift to the world. Jesus is. We Christians are not God's gift to the world. Jesus is. And if you look at our history, it's not just the Crusades, it's not just residential schools. We could name on and on and on. It's not just slavery. There are so many times when we as Christians have utterly failed to be examples of Jesus. But then we walk around as a group fully confident that if we think something or believe something, we must be right because we're Christians and we're good for the world. Jesus is good for the world. Christians have done lots of good things, but Christians have also done lots of bad things. And here's the other funny thing. As Christians, we like to say we about the good stuff. We have done lots of good stuff. We have done missions. We have helped the poor. Yes. But if we're going to use we for the good stuff, we've got to be consistent. And we also got to agree that we were the ones who, when the first people who came over to North America and South America and Central America were all Christians. And we perpetrated some terrible, horrible, horrific things. And when we understand that part of history, we realize humility. Actually, as a group, maybe we should question some of the things we think and act as a group, not just as individuals, but as a group. And that brings up a very famous quote that most of you have probably heard somewhere, and that is usually misattributed. Those who forget history are doomed to what? Repeat it. I think as Christians, almost more than anybody else, we should have some general understandings of what we've been like through the years. That was a Spanish-American philosopher, George Santayana. Oh, I love that last name. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Now you say, okay, here, I still want like an individual application of this message. Okay, I'm going to give you one. And that's not bad. We come to church and we have individual needs. But we as Christians have really come to view this like individualism has completely infected our faith. Sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. But we've come to think the Bible is just a manual, and it just tells each of us in our individual lives how to be successful. This is far more a group book than it is an individual book. This is not a book so much about your individual success, it's about us as the people of God. And what does it mean to be the kingdom of God here on earth, reflecting Jesus to the people around us? Now, on an individual level, so part of this is, and we're going to end with that in a moment, but I want to give you an individual thing here too. So part of that is, as Christians, we need to start thinking about, as a group, how are we reflecting the humility of Christ to our society? But you might be here today and suffering as an individual. You might be here today as an individual and you're thinking, you know what, this group thing, I can't even get to the group thing. I just need to survive this week. How does this story speak to me trying to get through this week? Well, one of the beautiful things when we think of the Bible and how it talks to us about the group over time is when you realize that you Here's the grand scope of history. 2,400 years ago, the people of Israel were going through this horrific time in Esther, in Persia. Before that, they were going through a horrific time in Babylon in the time of Daniel. Before that, they were going through horrific generation after generation of being a split nation, north and south, being attacked by the Assyrians and the Babylonians and yada yada. Before that, they had a horrible situation in the wilderness. Before that, they had a horrible situation as slaves in Israel. Then Christianity started, and we could go through history and talk about how every generation the people of God have suffered. And yet, here we are today. And do you want to know why that should be encouraging to us when we look in this ancient book and we realize that this book is not hyper concerned with how easy your individual life is right now? It's because history is too big. And the wonderful, encouraging thing about that is it means you'll get through your problems by God's grace too. Everybody's problems from previous generations are over. Your problems ultimately are small. Someday, we will spend eternity with Christ, and that will be the biggest reality. In the meantime, you join a long caravan of Christians and Jews and others who have trekked through life and gone through horrible things, and God will get you through your things too. I really believe that. So let's finish with this. Two characters in this story, Haman and Mordecai. I wouldn't want you to reflect on both of these. One of these will speak to you, one of these won't today. One of these you need, one of these you don't. But Haman reminds us to ask ourselves the question, what would it mean for us as Christians, as a group, to show more humility in our society? To be more aware of our checkered past. And that maybe it's Jesus who's God's gift to the world, not us. Or maybe Mordecai is speaking to you more today because you're in a situation where you are foolishly being obstinate. And you're actually making a small situation big. You're making a warm situation hot. You're making a fire where there doesn't need to be a fire. You're escalating conflict that doesn't need to be escalated. And maybe God's speaking to you today and He's saying, just swallow your pride and take a step back. Just swallow your pride and calm things down. Let some things go. Why don't you bow your heads and close your eyes, and let's just take a moment, as we love to do here at Crossview. We don't get a lot of moments in our modern society where we get to just be quiet and prayerfully think and prayerfully reflect. What would it mean for us, God, as Christians, as a group, to be more humble about our group? How would that change the way we talk, the way we present ourselves? Many of us face situations of conflict and difficult things. Where is our pride getting the best of us? Where are we making more of something than we need to? Where do we need to swallow our pride and let some things go? Father in heaven, I thank you for your mercy. You know, it's crazy. We have a checkered history as Christians. We have some good, we have some bad. And yet all along, you walk with us. All along, you don't kick us out of your family. Thank you for your mercy towards us. Lord, some of us are going through problems right now that feel so big. They feel completely life-consuming. Like, this is all there is. This is all there will ever be. But a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, time will go by and we will look back and that problem's not going to be as big anymore. Thank you, Jesus, for that truth. Give us strength to get through our stuff. Help us to be more humble. In Jesus' name we pray. And all God's people said, amen.